Hello, welcome to HLA Live. HLA Live is our regular broadcast on the HLA YouTube channel as well as all the other social media channels. Each week we talk to interesting people from across the HLA community.
Good evening, everyone. I am really excited to be chairing tonight's meeting.
Hi, I'm Rosie Spooner and I'm hosting HLA Live this Wednesday.
And I'm an HLA scholar and I'm also going to be your host this evening.
To share with us their ideas and their innovations and hopefully bring them to a global audience.
Quite quick, we have ideas, let's do this, let's do that. So
many of the topics come from our community, with scholars and faculty expressing an interest in many of the discussions that we're about to have.
Hello everyone and welcome to the HLA Live session on widening participation in the postgraduate realm.
Homelessness and health.
Addiction and the new normal.
HLA programs are built on 6 pillars. The leader is an innovator and entrepreneur. The leader is a communicator. The leader is a manager. The leader as a negotiator. The leader as a follower. And the leader as a philosopher. If you are interested in becoming a HLA scholar, why not get in contact? Many of the episodes in HLA Live will cover one or more of these important pillars. The HLA team consists of Pedra, Eamon, Tim, Riddy, Alistair, Adil and Trisha, and a range of other HLA scholars and faculty. Episode 39 of HLA Live is Let's Talk About Organ Donation, hosted by our scholar, Lara.
As I said before, my name's Lara. I'm a HLA scholar, and first I'd like to thank all our guests and our panelists for joining us this evening to talk about a very important topic, which is organ donation. I'd like to start with the first question to Mr. Mike Stevens. If you could share your experiences as a lead for organ donation in Wales, what have you found the most rewarding, most challenging aspects of your role, and how that has changed because of the pandemic?
Well, that's a very broad question. Most rewarding part of my role. So my role is quite varied. I do a variety of different things from a clinical perspective, from a sort of practical perspective, if you like. Then I do organ retrieval surgery, and I also do kidney and pancreas transplant surgery. So both of those things are, of course, enormously rewarding. That you can see the direct benefits from transplanting patients. You see their improvements in quality of life. We're very fortunate in transplantation to look after our patients for the long term. So, unlike many specialities in medicine, where if you have a success, you sort of discharge the patient back out to the community. You don't see much of them again if they're doing very well. But because of the nature of medications and things that are required with transplant, we do see our patients very regularly. So I get to enjoy watching them develop over the years, watching them have their families, and sometimes actually their families coming. There's many kidney diseases that run in families, as you probably know. So we often have multiple members of the same family that we look after. So that part of it is extremely rewarding. On the organ donation side, it's an absolute privilege to be able to help carry through the decisions that people have made in life as to what happens to them after their death, and to know that we can help them and their families to carry through with their decisions. It's quite demanding from an emotional perspective to spend a large amount of time dealing with scenarios that have involved people dying, of course. But when you link that whole story together with the fact that I can then, in the other part of my job, see the patients who benefit from those organs, it kind of rounds the circle and makes the whole story make more sense, really. So that's the kind of the obvious aspects that are rewarding for me personally. In terms of challenges, well, there's the challenges relating to the pandemic. I suppose there's two ways of thinking about that. First off, early on, we just didn't know how to have any control over the virus at all. As everybody remembers, back March last year, we weren't able to test anybody, including organ donors. We didn't know how virus would affect transplant recipients. So it really meant that organ transplantation in the UK almost stopped. It did keep going, but it really was crawling along for a month or two, whilst we were just trying to get an idea about how how we could test our donors and our potential recipients, and how we could keep them safe in the communities. So there's a huge drop off in the number of donors available and the number of transplants that went ahead. On top of that, then of course, a larger number of staff were redeployed into other areas away from their normal work to try and help with management of the pandemic. Lots of our staff were redeployed to the intensive care units. We lost access to operating theatres because the operating theatres were being used as intensive care units. So everything changed really during the pandemic, and that was hugely challenging. But the British population and everybody who works in healthcare really pulled together, and actually even in the summer we managed to get transplantation organ donation back up and running, and actually over the summer months, July in particular was incredibly busy for organ donation across the UK, and transplant activity almost as high as it's ever been. So that's a good indication really of how positive people view organ donation, and how keen they were to get things up and running, even in the middle of our worst health crisis in living memory.
Thank you for sharing that. There's a lot of interesting points there, particularly and how people responded sort of after the coming out of the pandemic to still wanting to continue to be donors. And I'm aware that we have a lot of panelists here that are involved in raising awareness and campaigning and championing that discussion about organ donation. And I'm wondering if I can bring in Anna and also in fact all the panelists on this topic of sharing your experiences of raising awareness and campaigning to get people talking about organ donation.
Yes, well, the conversation is obviously key, and from what you knew, Lara, when I actually presented to the students for organ donation, I myself didn't want to have that conversation, and it was my husband that raised it just 2 weeks before the actual incident, and it was me that shied away from it. I didn't want to talk about it. It wasn't something that was ever going to affect me, therefore I didn't need to have that chat. And during that traumatic 24 hours, that was the only time when I was asked a question that I didn't have to think, because I knew what the boys would have wanted me to do. And the positivity that I've had since from the donation has really, really helped me. So and through all the education programmes that we've been doing across Wales, it's become really clear that actually it's like with children, they don't look at it as something to do with death. They look at it as a gift of life. It's us adults that are afraid to talk about it. And so that's what we've been looking at, is changing it to try and just get everybody to talk about it. I always say to everybody, we're not telling everyone to be an organ donor. That's your personal choice. But what we're doing is we're encouraging you to discuss it, and so that you would know what your loved one would want. And as Mike said then, you know that you're respecting somebody's wishes after their life. And, Fraser's donation in itself is, now I understand a lot more about transplantation. I even see even more what a superhero he was to be able to donate after such a trauma. And now to know that his, literally his heart keeps on beating because they were brave enough to tell me what they would want to do, then therefore I'm sure that everybody can be brave enough to just try and have a conversation, whatever it is. And as I said, it's a debate, but what became really clear is we're quite happy to talk to our children about sex education. But organ donation, there's some kind of stopper that we're not talking about it at all. And that to me just seems strange. I even went to the extremes of, I told my late husband, I wanted to be buried. I knew he wanted to be cremated, but I still wouldn't talk about organ donation. Why? So therefore there is a stopper there. So we've tried to see about encouraging people to talk about it. And luckily that's where we had the assistance of Mike over in LA, who produced our little animation to allow parents, stroke children, a bit of a conversation starter to try and think about how to have that conversation. And I think now the conversation is more key than ever. You know, I think I was in the hospital and you know, I had my family members around me making that decision at that time. But now, obviously, times have changed and we have to think about who would be in the hospital, how much support that you would get when making or being approached for that decision. So even now, the conversation to me is more important than ever.
Yeah, thank you so much. You made some really interesting points about having that conversation with your family and just getting people talking about it. I'm also aware that Mr. Oren, you also have started a campaign, recently released a campaign, Given the Gift of Life Youth Ambassador, which is trying to address the urgent need for more Black donors.
It's part of a series of different projects that we've been doing in terms of trying to get more people from our background to understand and appreciate why pre-May last year there was a need for people to register as organ donors, and now since the change of law in England in May last year, people to understand that why the law was changed, why the need and the urgency for people from our racial background to stay in as a potential opted-in deceased organ donor, and also contemplate living donation as well, because the conversation in our community, and there are other communities, but speaking from the Black community, it's a totally different scenario in terms of where the starting point is, because there are deep mistrusts emanating from the community at all generational levels that are historical, factual, anecdotal, mixed in with what Donald Trump might say fake news. So you got a combination of things that are happening in the debate about organ donation and other related serious health issues like COVID-19 and the vaccines, where people are hesitant about being a potential donor. And so what we do, we utilize young people, influencers in social media, to music, to arts, as well as those as patients and donors from our community, to articulate why they're involved, the importance of being involved as an organ donor, how important ethnicity matching is the key to finding donors for people from our background who are waiting longer than most in terms of looking for a donor. So it's education, it's culturally based nuances of a generic message to make people feel, right, they're talking to me in a way that I can relate to and make me stop and think about making an informed decision based on fact rather than what we call myths, fears, and taboos. And despite historical things that have surrounded the Black community to do with the medical establishment, we still are saying it's down to our choice. We need to make a choice, but make an informed choice. And so through the projects with young people, peer educating, especially from sixth form upwards, it's making a difference. But we need to accelerate the pace, because time is of the essence for patients waiting for an organ donor.
Yeah, again, it just emphasizes the importance of having these discussions. And I wanted to bring in Dr. Sahira on this topic, because I know you do a lot of work with the British Islamic Medical Association, and you've run a campaign reaching out to members of your community to talk about organ donation as well. So I want to bring you in on this. How do we, within our circle of influence, whether it be within like our communities, how do we get people talking about organ donation?
Yeah, I think in the ethnic minority community, in the Black and South Asian communities, this conversation of organ donation is a really urgent conversation. And the reason is that we are disproportionately affected by chronic disease that affects our kidneys, for example. So where we have 14% of the UK population being Black, South Asian, there are almost 32% of us on the organ waiting list. That's a huge proportion. And unfortunately, again, from the Black and South Asian community, only 8% become deceased donors. So there's this kind of crisis and need in our community for people to be donating. So for many of us, it's a very personal thing. It's people we know, people in our social circles that are affected. So there's a very urgent conversation that needs to happen. And I love what Anna said about sparking that conversation, just getting that conversation started, and what Oren said about that kind of need to educate. And that's what the BIMA campaign is about. It's about bringing the right information and educating our communities so they can make the informed choices. So first of all, raising awareness of the need of this crisis that we're under. I don't need to tell you guys that the Black and South Asian communities suffer greatly from diabetes, high blood pressure, with a chronic disease that affects their kidneys. Often kidney disease runs in the family, yet they're going to be on the waiting list for donors, for a donor for much, much longer until they get matched, because we know that ethnicity matters. If you're of the same ethnicity, you're more likely to find a donor or a match. And people from that background are more likely to die waiting on the list, unfortunately, for an organ. So what we want to do is bring the right education in terms of the right religious education, culturally appropriate information, using people from our community. So we are an organisation that our community trust, and we use religious leaders, people that have had, that are recipients of donors from the community, to raise awareness of their stories, and people like Mike, so transplant surgeons. So we often have panel discussions bringing this information to the community. And we found that when you're working with local communities, there's much better conversations that can happen. It's about building trust, because unfortunately, there is in our community a mistrust of the system. So one of the things we need to do is educate people on the process that happens, and the great respect that's given to the families and then the people that donate. And those simple things that we may take for granted that information needs to be brought to the community. So that's what our work is very much around, doing these events in our local communities around the UK. Last year we did 13 events in mosques, and then with the pandemic we moved on to webinars with panels, a whole panel discussing this issue. And we found that when you focus the education to your community and make it culturally and religiously appropriate, that you can change behaviour. So we've been seeing some really good results from these sort of events that we've been doing.
Yeah, that's really, really good to hear. You mentioned something quite important, like educating the patients on the process, and irrespective of which community you're reaching out to and talking about organ donation, that education and what the actual process entails is very, very important in building that trust. I wonder if I can bring in Mike on this in terms of how do you educate your patients on the process of organ donation? What are their main concerns, worries? And then I'll open that back up to the panel to see how, if they have anything else to add as well.
From a donation side, the education for my patients is mostly about live donation, because for me as a surgeon, my involvement in the deceased donation, the first time I meet the patient is actually in theatre. So for me, I spend a lot of time trying to raise the profile of organ donation generally, which helps with the hopefully helps with the understanding in general for the population. But for my patients, it's mostly about live donation. And the education is really about explaining that there are many people in the community who can potentially donate a kidney. and that the process for assessing them is extremely rigorous, which means that we will only allow people to go forward with donation if we are very, very confident that they can come through the procedure and that they won't come to any significant harm in the long term. And probably so from the donor side of it, the education part is about explaining those things. There's actually a big part on the live donor side about encouraging individuals to allow their friends and relatives and loved ones to donate to them, because there is a natural instinct for most people to say, this is my illness, I don't want to put my loved ones through the process of having to donate. So I spend a lot of time explaining that actually this is a safe process for donation, and actually allowing the individuals to at least make their own decision on that is the kind of the right way to go. So a lot of our areas of education is actually around trying to break down those gatekeeping moments where the individual patient is reluctant to discuss with their relatives about this being an option.
Interesting listening to Mike talk about this in terms of living, because our gut instinct is that within the Black community, there's probably a better chance of having the conversation about living donation than it is deceased. Deceased is very much the taboo subject. The closest thing to not being here. But living donation, if explained rationally and pragmatically to people, especially from our background, we tend to find that you can have a decent conversation, especially since many of them will be aware that within their own family circles and close friend circles, they probably know someone who's waiting for a kidney donation, but don't realize the significance of how powerful. But I wasn't going to say easy, but it's not easy, because as Mike rightly said, it's a long process of testing, psychological testing before someone becomes a living donor. But understanding there's a journey that they can be part of to be seeing whether they can actually be the living donor. And we have found that we can have a conversation with people. Deceased is still something that we work on, but of the two, it seems that living is something that's more contemplated. And also we've been in rooms where we've found, we've recruited lots of people who have donated to each other who are Black, but didn't realize that they weren't the only ones. They were part of many others who have done the same thing, but they don't seem to realize that actually we're part of a family, a bigger family, and if we work together, we can actually promote this in psychologically in the minds of people to step forward at a faster rate.
I think the difficulty as a deceased donor family, if I put it that way, is it's when you're faced, and it's come out of trauma. So you've been through a traumatic event. Sadly for me, I literally witnessed it as well. And it also then, Fraser was transferred to hospitals, and it was there, but you can't really educate to the degree of the processes involved in a deceased donation, because I'm still getting my head around it 5 years on. And Mike actually is one of our trustees here as well. And every time I talk to Mike, it's like, I didn't understand that. I didn't think that happened. I didn't know that did. I mean, my 8-year-old, she did organ donation this lockdown, and I worked with the school about how we were going to do it for year 4. And then all of a sudden it was like, right, which organ is kept alive via oxygen and it was like, well, obviously the heart, but I'd never really thought about it. And therefore sometimes it can be very difficult to actually think about it sounds awful. It's a lovely story that Fraser went on and donated, but actually the education behind it, and I was a qualified solicitor, so I understood brainstem death because I'd studied it during my law degree, and I knew what my husband and my son would have wanted to, But for Joe Public, they've got to get their head around that probably it is going to be a brain death situation. And then it's going to have that conversation. And then you're going to have to go through the questions that are necessary for the transplantation to go through. And therefore, to educate extremely on the entire processes might put people off. So therefore, it's really tricky in my understanding, and that's why we very much focused on have that conversation, because at least if you've had that conversation and you know what your next of kin would have wanted you to do, and then obviously for me, from my point of view, I am now actually signed up. I didn't want to be an organ donor before all this, but now I'm signed up. But it's about actually saying, I'm nervous about this, I was nervous about this, but this is the positives that I gleaned personally from a donation. I do, sorry.
Do you mind me asking, do you think that the present day situation of the COVID situation and the vaccine situation and the debate that's going on right now, does that assist what you're talking about in terms of the future conversations that need to happen on organ donation? I'm just wondering, because, as you say, it's very difficult, but we're in a different scenario now. And I just wonder whether that conversation, that the COVID-19 scenario that everyone's talking about, does that trickle down into making it possibly easier to contemplate having an open discussion that we're having at the vaccine level on deceased organ donation?
I think that, in a way, yes, I do, because I think people have reevaluated the importance of life through COVID, and actually the importance of decisions to be made, and actually we should discuss things as a family rather than just discounting our children. I do think that, yes, that makes it easier. What I think is sad about it is that the media, in that extent, have focused so much on COVID that they haven't looked at the interconnections between donation, through the BAME communities, through COVID, and actually thought it through, that actually both of these could be discussed at the same time. And I think that this is where, and it was 5 years back in December, and we did quite a lot, and it's 5 years since our opt-out as well. And I must have contacted every media out there to say, this is what we've achieved in Wales in 5 years. This is England now that's come in. We're looking and we're hoping to translate the animation, and hopefully I can come to you two to maybe assist in this into some of the other languages, because there's no race in relation to it. But again, it might be easier as a tool again. And I contacted all the media agencies, but no, everyone's like, oh, this organ donation. I mean, we had, as you said earlier, Ori, you had your opt-out in England. It was like a damp squib. There was nothing at all. Like, if I hadn't been involved, as I would now call it, in the transplant world, I wouldn't have known. And therefore, but as we said, I think this is where we are missing the trick. Because now, as you said, and how many more organs are going to be necessary because of COVID? And so is that going to increase? I mean, Mike obviously knows a heck of a lot more than me in relation to this. But it's like, why can't we have the two conversations at the same time? Why aren't we allowed to have a conversation about organ donation, but actually we can talk about anything else? But I do hope that it will help.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I work in primary care, so during this pandemic and the COVID situation, I was at the beginning of the year doing a lot of conversations with certain patients about palliative care and where, if they got COVID and would they want to go to hospital or do they want to stay at home, and so the conversations about end of life. And unfortunately, where I work is it's a majority South Asian population, and it's a difficult conversation to be had. So I found a lot of times when I started this conversation, the family did not want to engage with it. So again, understanding the culture, understanding religiosity is really important when having such a sensitive conversation. But I also think when it comes to death and deceased donation, the one thing people want to know about is, will they be treated with dignity? Will their body, will their loved one, and will their body be honoured and treated with dignity? And I think if we can even just educate around that process, that's really empowering for the families and for people making that decision. And I know in a lot of faith communities, that idea of when you die, your body is still you still have this body dignity, whether you're alive or you're dead. The body has honour and needs to be treated in a certain way. So that conversation is important about dignity. And we have found that when we talk about, we don't have to talk about death in detail, we don't have to talk about the process in detail, but we talk about that aspect, the dignity that's given to the dead.
I mean, that's so important, that aspect of it, and it's a really difficult one to explain and to educate, because the process of surgery in itself is a difficult one for people to understand and get their head around. And it, not talking about just organ donation, but most people wouldn't want to see or hear about how an operation actually happens. So talking about these kind of things are very difficult. But what I can say with 100% certainty is that every organ donor is treated with the utmost respect at every part of the organ donation process. The specialist nurses who look after the donor and the donor family on the intensive care units, all the way through the process, are just wonderful. Everything that they will do is aimed at respecting the individual's decisions about making things as the family want them to be, as much as is possible to do so. When the donor then comes around to the operating theatre, there is utmost respect for what that individual has decided to do, what their decision is, and that's absolutely in everybody's mind in the operating theatre. The family of the donor, it's not unusual for us to have a picture of the donor in the theatre if that's what the family wants. Some families ask for that to happen. They want sometimes for the music that the donor enjoyed listening to play while we operate, and that's something that we'll do. Before we actually start the operation, we will have what we call a moment of honour, which is where everybody in the operating theatre pauses and gives their respect to the family and to the donor for what they have allowed to happen. Now, and it's obviously it's an extremely somber moment, and it actually is quite a difficult thing for sometimes from a surgical perspective, because the procedure is actually technically very demanding. It takes you need to be kind of on the ball to do this operation and to make sure that the organs are retrieved and sent to the transplant centres healthily. That moment of honour really brings the whole thing home, and most people wouldn't want to see an organ retrieval, but I can promise you absolutely that every element of it is done with utmost respect.
I do. In that, the following day when I was waiting, because Fraser's donation was in Bristol, so I obviously had to come back to Cardiff for my daughter, because I was only me then. And that was one of the things, actually, when I got the phone call the following day, they actually said to me that they'd done that, the moment of silence for Fraser. And that stays with me to now. Often you don't remember things, you can't remember things, you have to block them out. But I do remember them saying that to me, and it just showed me the extreme and the extent of how much. And now my understanding, as I was saying, of him actually managing to donate makes me even more feel how much respect he has got. And I remember it because I jokingly said that Fraser wasn't quiet about anything, and they would have done better off giving him a minute's round of applause or shouting, because that was more Fraser than being silent. But yeah, it was that level of respect And if you want to like pass that on at all, Sarah, whenever you're speaking with people, I can honestly say that to you, because they really did respect Fraser and continue obviously to do so. So yeah, it's because you get the trolls and you do get the comments, and even on the newspaper links, you know, and the horrible comments like, oh well, they didn't fight to save him because they wanted him for his organ donation. And you see them, and when you see them you can't unsee them. But I know that's not right. You know, I know that everything was done within the power, but you're always going to get that negativity, because this is unfortunately what our society is like at the moment. But it's actually knowing for first hand that they will be respected. And I remember the first time I met Mike, it must be about 5 years ago now, Mike, and him actually explaining to me that how you did a similar age child to your own, and you thought of me straight away, and how hard it was for you to remove in that situation. And I think that's the hardest thing. But the respect part, you know, I'm a very active Christian, so again, the faith part, you know, people, you know, sometimes come out, well, I need my eyes to be able to see my way to heaven. And it's very much of what we're in and how we have been brought up to do with that. But yeah, to know the respect. And actually my priest was with me at the time of donation, and having my faith guider there to say, you know, that really helped me. And so I think, you know, when we're talking about people having that conversation, here in Cardiff as well, we've been trying to work with the Councillor Dilwar Ali about integrating to talk to the local mosques, so that again, by talking to, as you were saying, the faith leaders, like I got that strength from, then I think that's the way to try and push it forward. But yeah, if you want, you know, as Mike just said, the respect is totally there.
Can I just say, we can talk about organ donation to death, about the process and the science and the medicine of it, but see, when you hear the personal stories like Anne just shared, that, you know, how can you dispute any of that? And to me, like, it has to be personal. It is personal, and those are the things that make an impact, and we need to raise awareness of these sort of stories and just the real life reality of this and the impact that it has. This is what we need to talk about.
Yeah, and I think the difficulties are because for a death donation, it comes out of trauma. And you know, it's very difficult to, and I wouldn't expect another family to be able to talk like I do. It's my personal choice. And sometimes, like tonight, you do break down and my walls suddenly drop for once. But it's very difficult to ask a lot of donor death families to talk about it, because it is so hard and it is trauma. Yeah, sorry, Aaron.
No, you're fine. And I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm taking this all in, and it's right and proper. You know how you feel even 5 years on, because the pain never goes away. But it's your voice, and voices like yourselves need to be heard. The donors, so the donor family needs to be heard. The recipients, if possible, need to be heard. But what was also interesting, as an added bonus for me, was listening to Mike on top, because I've heard from people in your position, Mike, but I've never heard someone speak like you have just now, in terms of telling and painting a picture of what actually is happening at that moment. You know, I know people who would stop and think about that situation, listening to what you've described, and I wrote it down here: the moment of honor, and what comes from that, or the moment of silence. Anna, that you mentioned, music, pictures. those last moments are so important to the family, and hearing from someone who's there, and it's the importance of it that you put and how individualized it is. Despite the fact you've done this many times, you've articulated that it's still very important, and you feel the relevance and respect that needs to be shown at that moment is so important. That needs to be heard at the highest level, because I think people will start to have a stronger appreciation about the whole issue about deceased organ donation, because if they would have seen and heard patient stories to a degree in terms of the donor family, maybe someone who's received, but that extra element that you brought to it, what you described, I think needs to be seen and heard as an added bonus on top of everything that we've spoken about, especially in this social and medical climate that we're in right now, where as you say, Anna, that discussion needs to be has to happen at the same time as what we're talking about COVID or the vaccine. Has to happen about donation, organ donation, and what we also do, organ, stem cell, blood donation. It's about giving something of yourself to someone else, but it relates to the discussion that's happening right now that the whole world's talking about.
I think it's it's been a really useful point, and probably something that we've kind of, especially the charity, kind of skirted around, which was the importance of, as you were saying, the respect to the body and the person. And I think we've failed to kind of realise, and it's not just, it's not a BAME matter. I would say it's also, as I was saying, your white matter as well, to do with the religious. And I think perhaps if there's, for me, one huge positives out of this is to say, hang on a minute, let's talk about this a bit more, Mike. Let's get this out. Let's explain a little bit more about what actually happens. Because if this is a stopper, and that's what you guys are telling us, we hadn't thought about that as being a stopper. So maybe that's how we can encourage the conversations as well.
I really think it's a case of, just as at the beginning of life, as a baby, when the baby is born, the celebration and the euphoria and the feelings around that moment coming, the parents, the extended family, just how they feel. At the end, that Mike has described, the feeling of respect, the celebration of the life that's passing, all that needs to be represented. Because I think if people can understand that life cycle, you come in and you leave in a certain way, and what it can do, and you're passing on life to someone else as a bonus. That if you can crystallize that in a way of messaging, I think there's a stronger chance of people, especially with the fact that Wales and England and Scotland soon, understanding this, the greater good that can come out of organ donation, and link it to the life cycle of life. That I think we can collectively and individually put a different emphasis on the conversation.
I kind of feel a bit chuffed because I think we've got the formula right and it's working. The campaign that we were doing last year, we had events around the country, and when I said about the panel involves someone who can talk about their personal journey as a recipient or as a family member of a donor. It includes people like Mike talking about that aspect. So it involves these really important, real conversations, real stories. And I think that, this is why I'm so passionate about what I'm doing, because I know it's making an impact, it's changing behaviour. And especially now with this change of law, and as Oren spoke about the system mistrust, even more important that we're doing this work. Because unfortunately there are some myths and misconceptions. There was a myth going about that this is a way that the government will take our organs, and this law will come in and no one will have a say over how your body will be used. And and it's horrific to be getting messages like this. So it's even more important that we step up and have these really important conversations and put those myths and misconceptions to bed and raise awareness of the truth. This is why I think all of us are doing this work and we're passionate about this. It's real life for us. I personally have had a cousin, that died waiting on the donor list, one that received a kidney donation and is doing really well, and one on dialysis. So these are real stories and have a real impact on our communities.
It's interesting because a lot of those, there's so much overlap with all of these things, but a lot of what we found in Wales during the consultation period in particular, when we're talking about moving to opt out, because it was a long process. It was kind of 2010, 11 that the actual consultation with the public started for real. And during those kind of 4 years before the law became active, we spent an awful lot of time talking to people. And one of the things that's interesting is that it wasn't opt-out that was controversial, actually. It was other aspects of organ donation because people didn't understand. And lots of those things that were already said about the idea that somehow there's so many different aspects. Some people think it's tempting fate to talk about death, to carry your organ donor cards or to register on a register. Some people think, as Anna mentioned, that somehow the medical team won't work as hard to save you if you're going to be an organ donor, all of which, of course, is completely untrue. And actually, most of the useful part of our consultation on opt-out in Wales was just educating them on the process of organ donation. It's nothing to do with the idea of opt-out or opt-in. They were relatively simple parts of it. It was much more difficult to talk about the processes which aren't well understood. The idea that me as a donor surgeon, I am not involved in any aspects of the donor's care until the moment that they come round to the operating theatre. All of those decisions and the management of that donor up to that point are taken by a completely separate team who look after the person on the intensive care unit, have nothing to do with transplantation whatsoever. And only when those decisions are made that this person cannot survive or has already died will organ donation be considered. And there are other difficult concepts that are that need us to try and explain but aren't so easy, like the concept of brainstem death, which Anna Louise mentioned earlier on, which is quite a difficult concept to have, that you can be dead but your heart is still beating. And those kind of things make this whole thing so complicated, so difficult. And the only way we can explain it is with time and develop trust with our communities, and allow the time to have the conversations, allow the stories to come out. And you can't help but listen to Anna Louise, and obviously I've spent a lot of time talking to Anna over the years. I've heard her talk many times, and every time it makes you emotional. And you can't imagine what it would be like to be in Anna Louise's situation, but you can hear the hope that she has in her voice when she talks about Fraser, and and that his heart is beating now in somebody. You can hear that, and it doesn't matter whether you know Anna or you ever met Fraser. You can hear exactly what that means, and that's difficult you can't ignore that. And that gets the message. As soon as you know that this is a possibility, that this is something that can happen, it grabs people's attention. I think the other parts are really important there. The recipient story. I think it's important to tell more about the story of the people who are the professionals involved, because I think the specialist nurses in particular are an amazing bunch of professionals who the things that they do for the donor and the donor family are just fantastic. And those kind of things, I think, would help get around some of the ideas of trust that we're lacking. So I think it's the whole story that we need to be telling, really, and events like this hopefully will help us to do that.
I think it's also helped with our work with the Students for Organ Donation, actually, because they've been going in and teaching the children look at them. And also, and I'm sure you'll agree, Lara, it's given you a bit more of an insight into organ donation, which you weren't really privy to throughout your education until now, really. So I think, children, will relate to, I'm not calling you a child at all, Lara, but you understand what I mean. Somebody not as old and a mum like I am going into the school. So it's quite a useful thing to use the peers as well, I think.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I completely agree. I think everyone has made really, really important points in regards, and I feel like we've come to sort of a natural close unless anyone has any extra things that they want to say. But just to summarize a lot of the important points that have been mentioned already, this idea of when it comes to educating people about organ donation, the emphasis should be on building trust between people and healthcare professionals. The emphasis is on dignity, which sort of transcends age, whether we're talking to young people, old people, race or religion, and that there's a long way to go, and that discussions like this need to keep happening, so that we can keep unpicking what it is, so we can actually get to a point where people can discuss this openly, ask questions, and confront some of the misconceptions and mistruths that surround organ donation. So I would like to give everyone sort of 2 minutes maybe to summarize any last points that they want to mention before we wrap up. But this has been a brilliant and very inspiring discussion.
Yes, it has been. This has been a very inspiring session. Listening to Anna as her story, and it's very moving and very motivating in terms of trying to make a difference, in terms of messaging through what we do at the ACLT back to our community at all generational levels. And also what Mike has spoken about, from being in the theatre room, that side of the story is very important for us to add as an added essence, enhancement to our messaging. And listening to Sahira in terms of knowing and seeing how well you and your organization are putting the message together and making changes. It's a gradual thing, but it's good to know that that's happening, and we are learning all the time. So I'm learning from this, and also putting out there just the difficulties that we have, but the hope that's there in terms of trying to make a difference in our community on organization. So it's been very much a positive session I found from this, that's going to help us with, especially with our rollout of events, which kickstart actually next Wednesday. So we've got sessions, we're going to talk about organ donation and so on. So this is very timely, and it's something for me to use in a very positive way.
Well, I guess from a perspective, really, it's just that I think that we can. I've seen huge progress in the last 10 years, I guess, in terms of how much we're able to educate and progress organ donation, transplantation. So I think I hope we can keep going with that, because there's a long way further that we can go on this, but the sort of things that are important are being consistent with our messaging, and making sure that the human story is the center of it, and as Orion was saying, really is trying to link the whole thing in that cycle of life, and that that this is that if deceased organ donation happens, and that is the start of someone else's life at the same point.
Yes, I think what this panel has highlighted is that those real life stories are the most important way to educate our community and society. Yes, we have to have the information culturally and religiously sensitive and appropriate, but these stories transcend all of that, race, religion, and these are the stories of the donor families, the recipients, the health professionals involved in that process. Those are the things that we need to make people aware of and educate. Our job is to educate and empower people with that knowledge, with the right knowledge, so they can make an informed choice. At the end of the day, like Anna Louise said, this is such a personal decision. All we want to do is empower everyone to be able to make an informed choice.
Yeah, you're 100%. You're exactly right. I think the emphasis on that sort of human element and that transcending race and religion, and the fact that as healthcare professionals, our role is to assist in people making informed decisions is so important and so key. I want to thank you all again for joining us for this panel discussion. It's been really, really interesting. I've definitely learned a lot. It's been an emotional roller coaster, and it's been very informative. And I'm sure you all have learned a lot from each other, and hopefully we'll sort of network and continue to work with each other in your various organisations.
Thank you to everyone that made tonight's episode possible. Whenever our scholars are thinking about complex problems facing our health systems, we encourage them to think about how they make significant change in the world of healthcare. We are incredibly lucky to have some incredible scholars in the HLA. They use the HLA as a platform to take their ideas and bring them to fruition. If you are interested in the work of the HLA, why not join us at one of our future HLA events? Why not join one of our programs? Why not even become a HLA scholar? Thank you for joining us. My name is Johan Marlon, the Director of the HLA, and it's a good night from all of us.